This is all about VAMP, right? So, for those that don't know, VAMP stands for Visa Acquirer Monitoring Program. And that is basically just a fancy word to say Visa is kind of cracking down on high risk processing and high risk merchants to an extent, but specifically high risk processors, meaning processors that support merchants that are high risk and getting elevated levels of fraud disputes, right? So I do like some of the ways that they've gone about this, I dare I say, which is the fact that they've kind of loosened up the thresholds for individual merchants, meaning Visa's trying not to police individual merchants as much as they were previously, and they're instead really cracking down on processors, which is then requiring the processors to do the policing for them, which can be advantageous for some merchants, because processors really get to make that judgment call whether or not they want to keep a merchant on board or whether they want to get rid of a merchant from a processing standpoint. So I think that has some benefits, but generally it's quite bad. Mainly because they've drastically reduced the acceptable dispute ratios. So previously, everyone talked about the 1% threshold on chargebacks, right? It was technically like 0.9% on Visa, but for all intents and purposes, it was 1%. So when you got close to 1%, like 0.8, 0.9, 0.7 even, you would run into issues. Now processors are held to an even greater standard. So processors are required to stay below 0.5% currently, and that's going to move down next year to 0.3%, which is incredibly low, incredibly low. I mean, some of the lowest risk businesses we work with still have 0.3% chargebacks, and that's totally normal just because of friendly fraud and the way that the dispute system is set up. So processors are now required to essentially keep people below like the lowest viable dispute threshold ever, where bad things start to happen. That being said, the merchant threshold was simultaneously increased, and now it's 2.2%, which is fairly high. I mean, it's not incredibly high, but it gives you some room to run as a merchant where you're not necessarily going to get monitored by Visa. However, you will get monitored by your processor. So a lot of people saw this 2.2% and they were like, oh, I'm good. Because not only is it 2.2%, it's 2.2% plus 1,000 disputes a month. So not many people are within that threshold. However, your processor is not enforcing a 2.2%, right? So your processors are enforcing their thresholds that they have to be under. So, Mike, I know you've seen the official guidelines from a handful of processors out there. I know Stripe released theirs. I know there's a couple other processors. And it seems like they're generally not enforcing this 2.2%. They're instead enforcing their own kinds of thresholds. Can you talk a little bit about that and where the bar is now for what processors are enforcing?
Yeah, so if you look at it, and it's funny, I posted on X, I think it was like 2 weeks ago, Stripe announced kind of like their non-compliant threshold, which was at 0.5%. So I think it's a little deceiving with the new VAMP ratios because the 2.2%, like from the untrained eye, it appears it's higher, right? But it includes TC40s, which are essentially like true fraud, like alerts that are not technically a chargeback. It's something that the issuing banks will receive and can notate that's also included in your ratio. So in addition, that TC40 can then turn into a chargeback. So if you don't have these alerts installed, it's really, really easy to trick up these numbers. And so the processors are now looking at it from their end. And, I look at it from like when you're looking at a processor or, any ISO that you're working with, right? There's a portfolio mix there, right? And so you have some of these very low risk processors and even acquiring banks like Adyen, for example, they deal with a lot of retail businesses, a lot of like Fortune 500 companies. And I have a lot of customers that are using Adyen right now, but they're able to take some of that higher risk tolerance in through their portal because they have so much low risk business, right? So they're not really, really scrutinizing the merchants as heavily as a high risk processor that maybe does only e-com or gaming or adult or drop shipping, right? So those are where if you have a high mixture of that in your portfolio, that's where the processors now have to put a lot more pressure on their merchants in terms of driving their ratios down. So it's interesting because as a merchant, you're going to want to really analyze the processing relationship that you're setting up, right? It's not kind of this old way of just setting up with a processor that's high risk, takes everybody, because they're going to start putting a lot more pressure on an individual merchant level and really monitor you and then pass down fines if those start to attribute and rack up. So you want to be thoughtful in the approach and what you're looking at in terms of what processor you're setting up with to make sure that they can actually tolerate your risk and your profile, what you're selling, and obviously the aggressiveness in terms of like volume of sales and things like that. So it's interesting. Stripe just kind of just announced this a couple weeks ago, where if you're over 0.5%, you're considered excessive or non-compliant.
which is absurd. A half a
Right.
percent is like almost everyone. And
Hmm.
I'll just kind of add on to what you said with the TC40 and the chargeback thing. So a TC40 is like you said, it's a fraud notice, which is generally going to be the predecessor to a fraud chargeback. It can also get filed without a chargeback, which is concerning, right? But if you are looking at it from a high level, most chargebacks are fraud, and most fraud chargebacks, or all fraud chargebacks on Visa have a TC40, which means effectively your ratios just got doubled, right? If you previously had 10 fraud chargebacks and 100 transactions, you have a 10% dispute ratio. If you have 10 chargebacks in the age of VAMP and they're all fraud, you just doubled your ratio. Now it's 20% because you have 10 TC40s and 10 chargebacks. Now, obviously, the chargebacks can be mitigated through different solutions, which we're going to talk about, but the TC40s are in and of themselves there. And that's very concerning for a lot of merchants, which have kind of floated by with RDR and these other types of alert programs
Hmm.
and didn't really have to worry about their visa ratios previously.
Yeah.
And just really quickly here, I also want to talk about the actual financial impact of this. So we've talked a little bit about terminations. I think underwriting is going to get a lot worse as well. So what actually happens if a processor is over the threshold that they're supposed to be over? Right now, it's not on this page, but it's 0.7% through the end of the year. At the end of the year, it's going to drop down to 0.5%. And then it's supposed to drop down even more to 0.3% next April. So right now, if processors are above 0.7%, they're considered excessive. And they essentially get an $8 per violation fee tacked onto every dispute and every TC40, which means they're going to mark that up. It's probably going to be at least $10, as you see on here. Likely some processors are going to use that to make money. They're going to mark it up to 15, 20, $25. And they're going to apply that to every single dispute on the portfolio, which means as a merchant, even if you're the cleanest merchant in the world, you get one chargeback a
Hmm.
month, you're at like 0.1% VAMP ratio, you're still going to get more fees. Every single person on the processor is going to get more fees. It's not just the excessive merchants, it's every merchant. So VAMP is all about understanding the eggs that you're putting in the basket of your processor and making sure it's the right basket and that you have multiple baskets to choose from
Hmm.
based on how your processor is going to react to this and frankly just how high risk your processor is because this is definitely more advantageous for the Adyen's of the world to your point that have a ton of low risk business to balance out that high risk business. That's not saying it's safe. It's just saying they're going to be less impacted and probably going to freak out a little bit less than some of the other processors out there.
Hmm. Yep. Exactly.
So I just want to talk about what that actually looks like from a ratios perspective. So previously, this is maybe what your setup looked like. If you're using chargeback alerts, you probably have very little Visa chargebacks, right? You're going to have a lot of RDRs, a lot of Ethicas, a lot of CDRNs, and very few chargebacks. Generally, a merchant that would be around 1% without dispute alerts on Visa. It's going to be around, 0.1, 0.2% on Visa, maybe even less than that. And this is what it looks like with VAMP. So, unfortunately, alerts aren't typically going to help with the TC40. They are going to help with a chargeback, which means that without alerts, you would get double dinged. You would get dinged for the fraud chargeback and you get dinged for the TC40. However, this is generally what it looks like because most chargebacks are going to be fraudulent. Most chargebacks are going to have a TC40, and that also includes alerts. Most alerts are going to have a TC40, which means even if you still have that same setup on Visa, that same coverage, and very few chargebacks, you are still going to have a lot of TC40s that are going to get filed on the account going alongside those chargebacks because it it's a predecessor to a chargeback, right? A TC40 gets filed prior to the chargeback, which means that chargeback alerts work by intercepting the chargeback after it gets filed. But the TC40 is a completely separate process, and there's currently no types of alerts to intercept that TC40. So, not to make it too complicated, but basically, instead of having this much chargebacks that count against you, you're going to have this much chargebacks that count against you, which is incredibly concerning, obviously. I'm not sure if you had any thoughts, Mike, but I know that for a lot of people, they're very used to having very, very low Visa disputes and
Hmm.
not really having any issues. More of the issues are on MasterCard.
Hmm.
But right now, it is subject to change quite dramatically.
Yeah. Yeah, I would think before VAMP and in the prior state, like alerts would kind of bail you out a little bit, right? I mean,
Yep.
you'd be able to enact alerts and then you'd be able to issue the refund automatically in most cases. And then that wouldn't actually impact your processing account. It wouldn't show as a chargeback. But the game has changed, right? I mean, you can't kind of do the old ways of running these super aggressive funnels, like opting people into subscriptions, making things very, very unclear and kind of just moving from one mid to the other, right? You got to look at it from a very customer centric standpoint now because a lot of these TC40s and TC40s are just essentially like true fraud, right? Customer calls in, I have no idea where this charge came from, or your card was hacked or compromised. They are not sure who the merchant was that they interacted with, right? That's just a lot of these too could be they call it friendly fraud, where a merchant just isn't aware, like they forgot the name of the actual website that they made the purchase on, right? So these just happen, right? And they're unnoticed in the prior world because you can just use alerts and you're bailed out. Well, now you have to actually be very conscious of that. So TC40s are added to your ratio. So you really have to look at it from two different lenses now. There is the science, which is I think alerts, fraud, risk mitigation tools that you can do on the front end, having better like billing descriptors, things of that nature. But then there's the art. So you really have to look at it from when you're driving your customers from marketing all the way to purchase and then post purchase, you really have to optimize for customer experience and you really have to optimize for like clear communication. You got to have a really dialed in CS team. You got to make sure you're leveraging like order insights to say, hey, if the customer does have a dispute, if I zoom in on my statement as a consumer that purchased from you as a merchant, I should be able to see, hey, if there's a refund that I need um, to initiate, or if I have questions, I can call in, right? So there's tools and things that you can use, but you just really have to look at it now more than ever, like optimizing for customer experience. Like I totally get that everyone wants to scale. I totally get the marketing techniques that are out there. I've seen them all. So like I know how this all works, but the ultimate like guys that I work with that are the best of the best, they always optimize for the customer experience and then they start to add a little bit more aggressiveness as they go. But it's very difficult to kind of do that in the beginning and then course correct because then shutdowns happen, your chargeback ratios go up. It's like now with VAMP, it's almost like near impossible to kind of run the old school way. You have to slow down a little bit to speed up.
Yeah, 100%.
Mhm.
So I do want to talk really quickly. We talked about how most processors don't even show you your VAMP ratio. A lot of processors I've talked to still don't have this figured out, and VAMP went into effect 3 weeks ago. So if you use Disputify, you can see your VAMP ratios. there's a homepage prompt for it. All you have to do is scroll down. We activated it a month or two back for a lot of our bigger clients. If you still don't have this yet, reach out to us, or you can go on your dashboard and you can activate it. This shows you your fraud rate. As you can see, this is a real store. They're at 0.09% chargebacks. Incredibly low, incredibly low. Their VAMP ratio is 0.37% this month. So it's a lot higher. Last month they were at 0.04% chargebacks, virtually nothing. But the VAMP ratio was 0.45%. Now, this is still a fairly low risk merchant. They're not in trouble with a 0.3, 0.4% VAMP ratio. But this just shows like their VAMP ratio is 10 times higher than their dispute ratio. 10 times high. That's concerning. And if your dispute rate is not 0.04%, it's obviously even more concerning. So, again, feel free to reach out to me if you don't have VAMP metrics on your dashboard, but it's really important to understand where you're at. And you can get that data through Disputify. There's a couple different ways. You can also view it on the ratios tab. You'll be able to see your VAMP ratio per mid. And it's just very, very important to understand where you're sitting right now so that you're able to optimize this and ultimately understand if you're in danger or not. So, what are the overall impacts? Like, I know, Mike, you're saying that people kind of have to clean up their business models and just not run aggressive stuff. But I think a lot of people are probably watching this and they're like, I'm going to try to run my business how it's been profitable. I don't want to change too much. It's Q4. Like, this is not the time to make changes. Maybe next year I can clean up my act. What do you say? What are going to be the impacts long term to businesses that are kind of on the higher risk end of things?
Yeah, I would say, dig into the numbers first. I think that prior slide was a pretty good slide to kind of reference, right? Now, if you don't know your VAMP ratios, you should know them, whether that's through your processor, if you're using like a third party like alert system. You want to kind of work through the root cause issue and try to like go for improvement somewhere, right? And I know they're always the main KPI for everyone is like revenue and profit margin, right? That's always going to be the number one. And am I growing? But you also want to look at it too and kind of gamify this a little bit to where you're looking at your actual like risk profile, like and how you're managing that, right? So look at your chargebacks and dig into the data. So now if I see that the VAMP ratio on that prior merchant is 10x what the actual chargeback ratio is, that shows to me that there's some fraud problem, right? So like, are they running subscriptions? What does their funnel look like? How clear are their descriptors? Do they have like a good CS team? Again, kind of working backwards to like optimize for the customer experience. Because I think ultimately, if you look at it, you can get to the numbers and hit the revenue running a super compliant business and really optimizing for that customer experience. So I think kind of look at risk as a way that's going to help your business grow, not as like a negative thing. And I think that's where it's perceived negatively, right? And I'm a risk operations guy, talk to businesses every day. But a lot of times, 9 times out of 10, when I'm working with merchants, it's like the best thing that happened for them is when we go through these consults and we start to like really grow it in the right way to where they don't ever have shutdowns again. They don't really have to worry about this stuff. So I think, again, if, take it seriously, obviously, because you can't really spin up mids or accounts like you used to in the past. It's just a lot more gated now, or it's going to be than what it was before. And, I've had merchants recently that were shut down. We're having to move them to different processors, but everybody's asking for more information. Everybody is really conscious right now from a processor level that whoever they're letting through is gonna like cooperate and they're gonna run a good business. I just don't think there's really this secret like silver bullet weapon here or processor that is out there that's just gonna say they all have to comply, right? Or the penalties get fast down or you're shut down. So I think it's almost like I think, with every e-com seller that I work with, like it's competitive. They want to hit the revenue numbers, but make a competition with yourself to like manage your risk. I think that's the other part of the business. You can make it fun too.
Yeah, 100%. So I've been telling all of our merchants get backups, right? Because you never really know how your processor is going to react. And
Mhm.
backups are or just mids in general are already getting a lot harder to get. What would you say? Let's say I have a business doing 1 million a month. We have one main processor. Dare I say we're on Shopify payments. Um, what are my next moves to kind of prepare for this, assuming I've done nothing to prep? Maybe I'm not incredibly at risk, but I have a 1% VAMP ratio. What would you say I should do to prepare?
Yeah, I always look at the business model and the regions that we're selling in. Like, there's no, again, not like a silver bullet answer here. But if you're using Shopify payments, right now, and if you're running subscriptions on Shopify payments, like, don't do that. Definitely have like a third party processor, particularly if you're running subscriptions right now. The reason being is that if Shopify holds the account or blocks it, then you lose your tokens, right? So you can't access those subscriptions, and your MRR is like just gone. Um, but if you're just talking from straight sale and just looking at backups, I mean, if you're doing 1 million a month, definitely get at least a couple behind the scenes. I kind of break it into tier one providers and then like high risk providers. So they're kind of like higher level providers that have really healthy authorization rates. You have to do the volume numbers to get there, but you have that security, right? I know Shopify payments, it's easy, slick, it's got everything out of the box. But you have to remember Shopify is a payments company first. They make a majority of the revenue on payments. So they kind of create this moat around their ecosystem to kind of keep you in, but they also hold the bag for you at the end of the day, right? So you just want to diversify your risk as much as you can. And
Yeah,
yeah, you may lose some payment methods, but ultimately if you lose your processing account, then having less payment methods is really it's well, what's the point, right? So it's like
right,
if you can't receive payments at all, then you're dead
right.
in the water. So
Yeah,
definitely a couple backups if you're doing 1 million a month.
yeah, yeah, 100%. I think there's going to be more of a crackdown in the next couple of months as well because vamp fines haven't even been initiated yet. Basically, October is the first month that they're assessing the fines based on, and those fines are going to get passed down to the processors mid-November, which means right now processors even haven't even gotten a bill for vamp violations. And I think once they do, it's going to get even harder from an underwriting standpoint, even harder to get approved to the new processor, and even harder to keep a mid healthy at a
Hmm.
processor and processing. So I think it's very important now rather than later to get backups, have at least a couple in place. And as you mentioned, if you're running subscriptions on Shopify payments and you're even remotely high risk, just
Hmm.
understand that if you get banned, you lose all your subscriptions and there's virtually nothing you can do about it. I haven't seen anyone ever get around that. And that's very, very concerning. So I know some people that have lost quite a lot in subscription revenue through that. So I don't want to see more people have to go through that. So just want to make sure everyone is aware if you
Yeah.
are falling into that scenario with Shopify payments. Cool. So I don't know why these slides are cut off, but anyway, let's talk about what you can actually do because as we mentioned, there is no silver bullet to VAMP. We're talking about backups, we're talking about alerts, we're talking about a lot of stuff. These are not silver bullets. These are like if shit hits the fan, like you should still be able to run your business type of deal. But let's talk about what you can actually do to get ahead of this, to mitigate your risk as much as possible. And I hate to say it, but I don't have a TC40 alert to sell you. I really wish I did. I truly do. But instead, it's really just about preventing the dispute from being filed in the first place, which goes back to the fundamentals. And I think this is what Visa is trying to do. They realized the alerts were too OP and they realized that there was a lot of fraud that was kind of slipping through unchecked. And now they really want to kind of rein that in and they want to make sure people have the fundamentals down and are providing a good customer experience, which makes sense. We understand it, but there is some changes needed from some merchants. So we talked about subscription. I'm happy to go through this really briefly here, but it's not new stuff, guys. Like this is not like incredibly complex new information. It's like if you have a subscription, make it clear, Someone clicks a box. If they don't click a box, you need to show them in multiple different places on the checkout, on the product page, even in the cart page that they're signed up for a subscription. Have some emails that go out. Thanks for signing up. Here's a link to access your portal. Don't hide the cancellation button between
Mhm.
17 different clicks. Send out a reminder before you bill someone for a subscription. In that reminder email, talk them through if they need to cancel, if they need to pause, if they need to skip. And then, of course, we typically handle this on behalf of our clients, but if you get an alert or you get a chargeback, cancel the subscription. This is very basic stuff, but
Mhm.
still things a lot of people don't do.
Yeah, yeah, it's tough because you want to be able to convert, right, and build the MRR. And again, I've seen every strategy out there, so nothing is surprising to me that I've seen. But you always want to focus again, customer centric, give them the opportunity to opt out, have them opt in, right, or opt out once they've actually made the subscription purchase, and then just have that customer service team kind of ready to go
Yeah.
if they're, they have questions and stuff like that. So it has changed. I mean, it's going to be a little bit of a flip where you kind of have to go slow to go fast, right? It's very hard now, and I see this again going from 0 to 500,000 in a month, right? I think those days are going to be very far and few between. I think all the sellers are now going to have to take a lot more methodical approach, but I think that's Visa's intent and really from a high level view, especially with the next once I think it's November 17th is when the fees are going to hit. So then I think that's going to be like when shit hits the fan, I would say. So things will start trickling down here, and so you just want to make sure that you're taking more of a cautious approach on some of these
Yeah,
things.
for sure. Okay, so we've talked a good bit about subscriptions, which is probably a significant portion of the people watching this right now. But one thing that applies to every single person watching this right now is fraud, right? So I kind of split fraud into two buckets. There's friendly fraud and then there's true fraud. Friendly fraud would mean it's a real customer purchasing from you. Maybe they forgot about their subscription, maybe they just want to get a free product or they don't recognize the transaction or a numerous amount of other things. That is a little bit easier to curb, right? Provide a good experience, clear billing descriptors, remind people about subscriptions, like basic shit. But there is true fraud as well. And some people have good procedures around true fraud, some people do not. True fraud is essentially when people use stolen credit cards on your website. You can go on the dark web and buy millions of credit cards for ridiculous sums of money, like cents on the dollar. And a lot of people make a living out of doing that, going on random e-commerce stores, getting transactions through. Maybe they resell the product. Maybe they're just testing the card. They don't even care about the product. There's a lot of other ways that people use this as a business model, which is obviously a huge problem. And those are all going to result in fraud chargebacks. And you're not going to win any of those chargebacks either because it's a stolen credit card. You don't win those. You're not supposed to. So in those cases, it's all about prevention, which means you have to have some sort of analysis system on the orders that's scanning every single transaction that gets placed on your store and looking for any signs of fraud risk. And then you need to make sure, in my opinion, it's a fully automated system that's canceling out the high risk orders because a lot of people like they may get a Shopify fraud analysis, they may use a tool like ours or someone else's, and then they don't really have good procedures in place or like a point man at their company who is looking through all the scanned orders and then canceling the ones that are fraudulent. Or perhaps you want to verify the orders, reach out to the customer, see if it's legit. That's understandable, but you need to make sure you cancel these incredibly quick because typically the TC40s are coming in on the first week after the transaction. The chargeback may have a bit of a delay. Maybe it takes 2 weeks, but on these types of orders, they're quick. They're quick because people obviously like whenever you get your card details stolen, it's only a matter of time before you cancel your card, which is obviously generally a couple of days, a week or two. And whenever you report your card as lost or stolen, every single transaction from that point onwards gets a TC40. So it's very important to take aggressive action on fraudulent orders and cancel these as soon as possible, like day one, really. Ideally, like second one. Like, just have an automated system in place. We have one at Disputify that can scan orders, look for signs of fraud risk, and then just get them out because there's enough friendly fraud going on nowadays that you shouldn't have to worry about any of the true fraud impacting your VAMP ratio.
Mhm.
And then just make sure you're measuring it, basically. So with the TC40 reporting, most processors don't even offer this yet, which is absurd. And not really anyone understands where they're at. So again, if you use this beautifier, you can look at your TC40s and you can measure these over time. And I think it's very, very important because how are you supposed to change anything if you don't know where you're sitting right now? So I think there's a big focus on fraud prevention that again just goes back to the whole central point of for a long time people didn't have to focus on this because they had the alerts and that was kind of just a really easy solution that let them focus on scaling their business and fundamentals like this just kind of got pushed to the side. But that is no longer the case. And going into Q4, it's incredibly important to have the fundamentals down so that you don't get screwed because as we all know, there's a trend every single year where sales spike up in Q4, they generally drop in Q1, and then you have Q4 chargebacks and Q1 sales, which means your ratios just get skewed way out of
Mhm.
proportion. And with VAMP, when your ratios are essentially doubling or tripling or 10xing, as we saw on the other slide, that's not a good situation. So, doing everything you can now to just get the fundamentals down and dialed is going to help you drastically. And obviously in November and December, but truly in January is when I'm most worried. Because also in January, the threshold for processors gets reduced to zero point 0.5, and right now it's zero point 0.7.
Yep.
So, very, very concerning all around. Mike, any thoughts on the fraud prevention side of things?
No, I think you hit on it. I mean, obviously, you want to, if you don't have these processes kind of in place today, or a point person or a robust like front end fraud solution like Disputify, you definitely want to start implementing that. Again, it's art and science, right? The science is Disputify, but you also want to have your own internal team kind of managing this process. And then the other thing too is that once November hits, the October data will be available. But if you're a merchant that, let's say, you're over threshold, you'll be on like a 3 month monitoring program, right? So you have to have 3 months of like very clean processing history, and you have to be below the threshold. The other thing too is that the TC40s, they count in calendar months. So one thing I'm trying to let my merchants know about is that obviously with Black Friday here in the US, um, you're going to be pumping a lot of sales that day. That's one of the biggest, sale days out there. Then you have Cyber Monday as well. But you got to be a little careful too, because if you make a lot of sales and you're not really monitoring your fraud, there could be a lot of TC40s that just hit at November, and then it screws up your ratios really bad. So, yeah, I think in addition to what you're saying, it's just put these things in place and start to really put some thought behind it, and then just be wary. Have it ready to go by those kind of like those two key dates as you make sales and kind of go into the holiday season.
Absolutely, for sure.
Mhm.
Cool. So let's talk about some of the actual solutions and tools and kind of stack these up. So we call this a 5-layer VAMP protection system, which is again, fundamentals are what really matters here, but there are solutions in place, and you need to make sure you're using every single solution that you can get your hands on, basically, right? So fraud scanning is what we just talked about, ensuring that every single order gets scanned. You have some sort of AI analysis that's looking at the orders, filtering out the fraud orders, and canceling those automatically. That's table stakes. Everyone should be doing that. Absolutely. The next is order insights. So, not many people have used order insights for a very long time, but it's a really great solution, especially for specific types of merchants. Order Insight, we'll show you an example in a moment here, but it's essentially where you can add additional details on a customer's bank account, which is crazy. But if you use Order Insight and a customer signs into their banking app and they see a transaction that they may not recognize or they may not think they authorized, you can add details as well as push people to contact your support. So you can add your phone number, you can add a refund policy, you can add your email, you can add a description of what the charge is, you can add pretty much anything that you would ever want to add into their bank account. And that's essentially going to ideally push them to contact you before they file a dispute. It's a very, very cheap solution. It makes a ton of sense for virtually every merchant, especially subscription merchants. And it really has to be combined with instant support. Otherwise, it's kind of pointless, right? The goal here is in that split second decision when a customer is thinking about clicking that dispute button, they instead click that phone button and then they call your support. And if you have someone pick up instantly and process a refund or at least explain the charge and what it's for and reassure the customer, you're going to get ahead of those disputes in TC40s, which ultimately is what the only VAMP protection system is about, right? It's not about intercepting it once it's been filed. It's about preventing it from getting filed in the first place through business fundamentals. And order insight is a business fundamental that pretty much every merchant, especially subscription merchants, need to be using. Again, we'll show an example in a moment there, but super important. The next part of order insight is compelling evidence. Again, sorry this is cut off, don't know what's going on there, but
Mm.
compelling evidence is basically order insight on steroids. So it's not necessarily about providing transaction details, it's about showing that a customer is wrong, which is crazy. But if a customer tries to file a fraud dispute, and it's clearly not fraud. Compelling evidence can theoretically deflect that dispute and prevent it from ever getting filed in the first place. How it works is basically you can enroll in compelling evidence through a service like Disputefier, and then when a customer files a fraud dispute on Visa, if you're enrolled in compelling evidence, we essentially get notified instantly, like the second it occurs. And then we have 2 seconds to go query all of your transactions from that customer and provide them back to the customer's bank. And if we're able to provide two or more transactions from that customer older than 4 months, 120 days, and those two transactions are non-disputed, then we can show like, hey, this customer, they've been buying for years, for months, they've never filed a dispute. Why is this all of a sudden fraud? Real fraud gets filed within a couple of weeks. This has been a couple of months. This is not fraud. This is friendly fraud. It's not a real order. It's not a real chargeback. Don't let them file this chargeback. And most of the time, if we can provide that information, the bank won't let them file the dispute. Now, does that always work? Not necessarily. It's better for low risk merchants. For high risk merchants, the bank may see that and they may say, yeah, but we don't really trust you. We're going to go ahead and file this dispute. For low risk merchants, it works a lot better. One thing I will also add is it has to be processed on the same MID, the same processor, right? So those historical transactions and the one they're trying to charge back need to all be on the same processor. If you're switching meds consistently, that's probably not going to be the case, and compelling evidence probably won't be a great solution for you. We have some merchants getting a ton of value from it because they use one main med, they have a really long-standing subscriber base, and they're able to provide these additional transactions for a good portion of their fraud disputes, like 20, 30%. And there's no refund that you have to process, unlike every other type of alert. So it's really, really advantageous if you are the type of business that's going to get some value out of this, which is not every business, but for the ones that are going to get some value, it's a must have and you only pay if it works. So it's a no-brainer for a lot of merchants. It's not the end all be all, of course, but nothing is, right? It's just about stacking every single layer of protection that you can possibly have. So we talked about Ethica, CDR and alerts, and RDR alerts not really preventing TC40s. From the data that we've seen, RDR never prevents the TC40. Ethica and CDR and alerts, when combined, can prevent roughly 15% of TC40s, though. This is not technically supposed to be the case. But it is the case, right? And that basically just works. We're assuming because some customers' banks are going to file an alert instead of a TC40, which is great news for you. But it's not necessarily how it's supposed to work. So who knows if this is going to get fixed at some point. In the meantime, make sure you use ethical alerts, make sure you use CDR alerts, even if it only stops 15% of your TC40s, that's significant. In the day and age of VAMP, like you want every single ounce of protection you can possibly have. So it's not just about RDR alerts, definitely use Ethica and CDR alerts. I've also seen a lot of myths around like, oh, alerts don't work anymore. Why should I be paying for alerts? VAMP isn't going to be solved by alerts. Well, it's true that you can't get a 0% ratio on Visa anymore because of alerts. Your vamp ratio will double if you don't have alerts. So it's like you will die twice as fast if you don't have alerts. So unfortunately, like even though it's not as good as it used to be, you still stop a chargeback. And even though you don't stop the TC40, you do stop the chargeback. If you don't stop the chargeback and you just don't have alerts on, then it's going to count twice. The same dispute will count twice. If you do have alerts, you remove the chargeback, and then you only get the TC40 that counts. So it's a must-have, unfortunately. Well, I guess fortunately, but it's not the only thing that's a must-have. Everything on here is a must-have, especially if you're a subscription merchant. If you're not a subscription merchant, compelling evidence may not be really applicable. Order insight may not really be applicable, but you definitely need fraud scanning. You definitely need ethic and CDR alerts as well as RDR. And then you should truly be dialing in your fraud procedures and understanding exactly what's causing your disputes and trying to fix that root cause issue instead of just relying on some solution to, kind of patch on.
Yep.
Any thoughts, Mike?
Yeah, you hit it really well. I think compelling evidence is a little bit tricky, especially if you're bouncing from like different mids and you're not a long-standing brand, I would say. It's
Yeah.
kind of one that's kind of a new entrant into it because it relies on that data being seasoned and over a certain amount of time. So
Yeah.
I think the applicability, obviously, you mentioned with alerts and yeah, installing them now is more imperative, I think, than ever before because you're going to get double dinged with the TC40 in there and you don't have alerts. It's just going to blow the mid up pretty quickly if you're
Yeah.
running even, let's say, 0.5% a day with alerts, yeah, you're going to blow it up really quick. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, and I think the additional fraud scanning, like you mentioned earlier, and then the order insights piece, which I think you're going to cover in the next slide, is very important to add.
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people that I work with have the order insights per se,
Yep.
um, but it's something that we're working on getting a lot of the merchants on this because of the value in it. So
Yep.
I think this is really good.
Yep. Here's a practical example of order insight for like Disputify. If we were signed up for order insight, instead of just seeing this charge on your card, you'd be able to click into this. And obviously, I don't know about you guys, but when I go on my bank and I want to dispute something, I have to click the transaction anyway. So it's essentially when you click the transaction, showing a ton of additional details on the merchant. As you can see, there's like the phone number, there's the URL, there's the legal name, and then you can add all these customizable descriptions. So some merchants will just put like exactly what they do, like we're Nike, we sell athletic apparel, or they'll explain the charge. This subscription charge is Nike Plus, blah, blah, blah. Here's what it gets you. Or they'll just use this to tell people to contact their support. Instead of explaining what they are, the charge, whatever, they'll just say, contact this number for an immediate refund and really, really just try to push people towards contacting their support, which is generally the way that you're going to prevent the dispute, right? If a customer has problems, if they have issues, they want to talk to someone, this is about making sure they talk to you instead of talking to some representative at their bank and then getting their money back and, you get a TC40 in a dispute. And that's obviously what we're trying to avoid here. But again, this should be combined with instant customer support. You can use agencies if you don't have enough call volume in order to, have your own internal employees here. I highly, highly, highly recommend if you're doing above maybe 500K a month, have some sort of person who's going to pick up a phone number instantly and help sway the customer not to dispute a transaction. This also depends on the demographics you sell to. If you sell to, let's say, like Gen Z, you could potentially have something in your description that says call or text the number above, and you could offer SMS support as well because most Gen Z people they don't like to call, and most banks don't require that you call to open a dispute anymore. You can just do it on the app. So just make it as easy as possible for people to contact you and get instant support, including subscription cancellations and refunds. This is the presentation we had. I want to dive into the QA side of things right now. I'm going to go ahead and open that up. If you have any questions, now is the time. And really appreciate you guys hanging around. Hopefully, this was valuable and you got some good information from it. All right. So, how do we update our order insights? We use Thrivecart and have authorized.net. So, within Disputify, you can update your order insights under the alert configuration. If you're not using Disputify, I'm not exactly sure. With Disputify, there's two ways you can do it, depending on the kind of software and the version of our app that you're on. Number one is under alerts. There's alert configuration, which allows you to do order insight. Number two, you can always contact our live chat. We have 24/7 support with a real person. You can just ask to set up order insights, and we'll kind of walk you through that process. There's a good bit of information that you need to provide in terms of like the description, the phone number, legal name, DBA, email, refund policy. There's a good bit of information. It's chunky. It's a it's
Mhm.
not like a very simple sign up process, but once you fill out that information, then we'll go ahead and get you enrolled. It takes about the same time as RDR does, so about typically 3 to 5 business days, sometimes slightly longer. Next question is for subscriptions, you spoke about losing customer tokens slash MRR. What is the best way not to lose these tokens and store them when running on a third-party processor? Mike, it's up to you if you want to handle
Yep.
that. There's a bunch of solutions out there.
Yeah.
But you wanna run through that one?
Yeah, so for subscriptions, if you're using like the likes of like Shopify, I mean, they have all these different subscription apps that are out there. So depending on what one that you can work with, you can utilize like a third-party payment processor or gateway like authorized.net. That seems to be the most common one. And then you can vault and store the tokens within authorized.net. And then you can really use any third-party processor and it just links into authorized.net. So you would just update, the MID information and port those over. If you're using Shopify payments, you're just kind of stuck. So the back end of Shopify payments is Stripe, so they're going to hold store the tokens, and it's really next to impossible to get those tokens out. I mean, there's ways that you can kind of go after them on this, but that's what I'd recommend. And then also for subscriptions as well, highly recommend a third party, funnel, whether it's, Funnelish is a little bit more for testing, I would say. There's Checkout Champ, there's Phoenix, there's these different types of solutions that will allow you to run a more robust subscription management solution or offer, and they'll store the tokens within their platform. So you can use hundreds of different processors on Checkout Champ if you'd like to. That's probably been the biggest recommendation that I'd say is really just kind of get off of Shopify and move it to a higher level like subscription management software.
Yeah, definitely. Depending on how you run subscriptions, physical, digital,
Mhm.
options,
Yep.
etc. And then the second part of that question was one current problem that this attendee is having is for subscription customers, they're getting multiple TC40s over several months. So one customer is causing three or more TC40s, and how can they prevent this? So it's kind of always been an issue with obviously subscription payments. You're billing the customer every single month. They may charge back 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months of transactions. There's not much you can do about this, frankly, besides order insight and compelling evidence. Compelling evidence is kind of designed for this problem. So at least a customer can't hit you after 4 months. If they hit you after three, there's not much you can do about it. But if they hit you after 4 months, then you're eligible for compelling evidence. And that's definitely what I would say is going to be the best solution there for preventing those one customers causing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 plus TC40s. So definitely would recommend compelling evidence in that instance. It's not going to be a end all be all solution, but for those ones that are really going to cause the most TC40s, it should help.
Mhm.
I
Yep.
like this question. So, how exactly is this a problem for processors like PaySafe? Can't they just charge higher fees and don't care about numbers other than higher fees? So, this is an interesting question because I think a lot of processors may misunderstand this and a lot of merchants do too. So, a lot of processors, probably PaySafe included. I don't know about them. I know like Maverick and a handful of other
Yeah.
big high risk processors are like, oh, it'll be fine. We're just gonna pass on the fees. We're not worried. But guess what? I talk to these processors and they're having to shut off accounts and they're going to have to shut off a lot more accounts. And it's not their choice. It's their acquirer's choice because VAMP is Visa Acquire Monitoring Program. every single processor, PaySafe, Maverick, Stripe, Shopify payments, they're not the ones that are sitting at the top of the food chain. They all have a bank that they're working with. And at the end of the day, the bank is the one getting the fines. The bank is the one getting shipped from Visa. The bank is the one making the calls to shut off merchants. And as much as processors want to say they're just going to pass on the fees, they don't know that. They don't always have that discretion and that choice. They may try to do that. Some processors are going to be more firm on that than others. But at the end of the day, the processor doesn't have the say. And I've heard some very scary things with Visa saying that if you're out of compliance as an acquirer for 3+ months, they can terminate your agreement to process Visa cards. Will they actually do that? Probably not. Maybe if it's incredibly excessive. But as a processor, that's scary. So we may see some processors just terminate merchants. And even if the processor wants to keep them on board, the processor doesn't always have that ability. I don't know if you have any other thoughts, Mike, but
Yeah, I mean, a lot of processors too. I mean, depending on the relationship and the volume, and obviously the processors are in it to make money too, right? They get a
yeah.
percentage of whatever your sales are. They'll typically notify you. They'll put together like a remediation plan. All the processors, we're hooked in with 30 different global processors, and we work with PaySafe, and with them, they'll typically communicate something to you, so they give you kind of a warning before things kind of unwind, or they charge higher fees and things of that nature. So um, that's what I've been seeing more. It's with like mass cuts and things like that. Those are more for like I think like bigger like processors. You have like the likes of WorldPair for TSYS Direct or First Data, things like that. But typically these more boutique places where if you have like a really good agent that's supporting you, you're going to receive some sort of communication. But yeah, you're right, Mark. It's not just going to be passing the fees down. They want to see the improvement and the movement forward. And unfortunately, they have to keep their portfolio risk clean too. So they have to kind of pass it down.
Yeah, for sure. What I have seen already too is processors just saying that the amount of TC40s you generate does not make them enough money. And if they increase your fees, then it makes sense for them. So I think we'll see that a lot more. I mean, processors are obviously in this to make money. They love adding fees everywhere they possibly can, and this is a great
Right.
excuse to do so. Um, Another question. So for TC40s, are those all alerts or just RDR? So basically, all alerts and chargebacks that are fraud are going to come in with a TC40. There is going to be some percentage of Ethica and CDR alerts that prevent the TC40, but it's pretty minimal, maybe up to 15% of that. No RDRs are going to prevent TC40s. RDRs prevent chargebacks, not TC40s. Ethica and CDR alerts are not really supposed to prevent TC40s either. They always prevent chargebacks, but they don't always prevent the TC40. It may prevent a little bit of them though, maybe 10 to 15%, a lot more than RDR does, being at 0%. So again, this is only for disputes filed under the fraud reason. So all alerts have a reason that they were filed, and most of them are fraud. Like I think 70 to 80% of the chargebacks we do are fraud. So in general, 70 to 80% of those alerts and those chargebacks are going to have a TC40 attached to them. And then Julie asked if there was any cost on Order Insight through Disputify. Right now, we're not charging anyone for it. We have a bit of a hard cost. It'll be like 10 cents per lookup once we do start charging people, which means when a customer like clicks on their bank transaction, it's like 10 cents. So it's incredibly minimal. And it's not a big cost. We don't have much of a hard cost, so we're just doing it for free right now, and then we'll eventually charge like a 10-cent fee per lookup. So it's very, very, very minimal. And there will be a recording to this. We'll distribute it and we'll email this to every single person who attended and probably post it on social media and stuff too.
Mhm.
Someone asked, I use Checkout Champ, but are the tokens not stored on the mid? They're stored on Checkout Champ. That's correct. Mike,
Mhm.
correct me if I'm wrong. The subscription tokens are stored on your subscription platform in the case of Checkout Champ. So you can move those from mid to mid, and that's kind of the whole point of Checkout Champ.
Mhm. Yep. They're just going to trigger, basically checkout champs is going to trigger the processor to run the transaction every time there's a recurrence of that billing.
Yep. And then someone else asked another question along the same lines. If your subs are vaulted on authorized.net with a native Shopify checkout, can you still move them to a third-party checkout software? Have you ever done this, Mike?
With I'm assuming, yeah, native Shopify checkout, a token migration, yeah, because basically the tokens are just going to be within the authorized.net portal with the processor, and yeah, you'll be able to move those over
Mhm.
to a third party
Versus
checkout.
Shopify payments, in
Right,
which case those are stuck on Shopify, and there's pretty much nothing you can do about that, from
right,
my knowledge.
exactly.
Someone
Hmm.
said, "How do you see the future situation with AirWallex payments to know if I should look for alternatives?" Mike, you're a big AirWallex guy. Do you want to kind of
Yeah,
handle this? I don't know if you've seen anything recently.
yeah, it's very unique, right? I mean, the whole landscape is changing, and I kind of bucket Airwallex as like I don't know, it's almost like a Stripe again in a way. They have obviously the global account feature and things like that. It depends on the region, right? So if you're looking at it from like the Hong Kong setups to Europe, UK, and then US, Hong Kong is very, very different right now in terms of the environment, who they're willing to accept and kind of retain. The US is tougher to get approved. I mean, I think all around it's tougher to get approved. So I just think Hong Kong, there's kind of like a big de-risking going on over there. And I speak to Airwallex all the time. The US teams seem to be a little bit more accepting. They are getting away from just traditional like clothing drop shipping merchants. They really are just kind of moving away from that stuff. So it depends on the industry and the vertical. There's a lot of things that I can kind of say about Airwallex. They've been a great partner to us, and they're very communicative. But I have seen that they are pivoting away from like the old model of like drop shipping and clothing and things like that, because those
Yeah,
seem to be very hard to be successful in. You rarely see
long
great
term.
clothing drop shippers nowadays.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Really good points. I think in general, no matter who you use, have a backup if you're even like slightly risky. Um,
Mhm.
Another question, why this is a good one. Why is Visa being so extremely strict and not realistic, like 0.5%? Great question. Theoretically, having talked to people at Visa, they say that Visa Risk brought in a lot of new team members that had no idea how anything was going, and they wanted to make their mark, basically. So this was their way of doing it. Um, I think there's a really good chance that this blows up in their face. I think it already has. That's why they've changed it 3 times. Why they're being so unrealistic, who's to say? From my understanding, they brought in a lot of new people that maybe didn't get the industry and wanted to shake some things up. So it's hard to say. I mean, obviously, it's a crackdown on high-risk processors, but the thought behind that is TBD. Whether it's a they're just trying to make money, which they will make a ton of money in fines, whether it's they're trying to, clean up processing and eliminate fraud. That's what they say for sure. I think it's a double whammy for them, but Visa's Visa. It's hard to say exactly, but I think there's a lot of factors that go into it.
Because everyone's going to start paying in crypto or accepting crypto. It's like we're just going to get
Yeah,
off the
right.
Visa rails and say, see you
Yep.
later.
Yep.
So,
Yep. For sure. Incentivize them, a 5% discount with crypto or something, or even pay by bank, I think is going to be really advantageous here. Not to mention MasterCard. All right. Can you please repeat the VAMP ratio that we should stay under below? So that's a loaded question. The processor is going to get moved down to 0.3%. So if you could stay below 0.3%, be my guess. I think realistically, 0.5%, even that's not realistic for some merchants. It depends on the processor. Some processors, they say you're good if you're below 3% VAMP, 4% VAMP. 2% VAMP. I have seen a lot of different percentages, and I think it really depends on the processor. Some processors are going to be cool with 2% all day, every day. Some processors are not, right? So it definitely depends on where you're getting your payments from. I think in general, if you want to be as clean as possible and you always want to be below your processor thresholds, obviously like stay below 0.3%, but that's probably not going to happen for a lot of merchants. So I would say in general, if you could stay below 1% VAMP ratio, you should be okay. I'm not saying you're going to be okay everywhere, but you should be okay at least with some higher risk processors that have a tolerance for it.
mhm. Yeah, a little bit of a moving target. Depends on the relationship with your processor, obviously. I mean, Stripe just made this massive like announcement, like I mentioned a couple times now, but it's like, wow, they just said 0.5%, and you're considered like non-compliant over that ratio. So,
Yeah.
everyone's kind of making their own rules based on their portfolio and like what their risk level is within their portfolio and where those ratios are at. And then they're just kind of like making a number based off of that. So again, processors that kind of have a lot of low risk merchants and don't really have a problem with VAMP are able to kind of be more tolerant. Ones that have a lot of high risk merchants on their portfolio are going to be less tolerant. So it's a little bit different, but like as Mark said, whether it's below 1% or even 0.75%, I mean, you kind of want to look at it from that angle.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. The last question isn't really a question. It says Shopify payments are cooked. No question mark. But yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
I think so.
Shopify payments are, they've seen a huge crackdown recently. I don't think that's going to get better anytime soon. I think it's going to get worse. I think if you're going to protect yourself and you're on Shopify payments, protect yourself now, right? As soon as you possibly can, do everything you possibly can. Because if you're still left, that's great. But I don't think the cuts are going to stop here. I think they're going to continue.
Yeah, definitely get a backup. Can't
Cool.
rely on that only.
All right. Unless there's any more questions, I think we're probably going to wrap this up. We're a couple minutes over time. Thank you guys so much for hopping on. I hope this was helpful. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but at least you can hopefully leave this feeling more informed and just understanding VAMP a little bit more. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. You can find me on Twitter, Telegram, WhatsApp, Slack, email. Reach out to me or reach out to my team, and we'd love to help you. Reach out to Mike's team as well. They're the best in the game. If you need any help with payments consulting, getting new processors, understanding where you're at with VAMP and how you can prepare for that, definitely hit up Mike. Their team is the best in the game. Also, God forbid, if you have any holds, have any processor issues, contact Mike. They get millions of dollars in holds released every single year, and they'd love to help you out as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate you having me on.
Thanks, guys.
Yep. Later.